Okay, good. There we go. I'd just like to start first by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land from which everyone is joining us online. Here in the Carlton office, that's the Wurundjeri people from the Kulin Nation. And I'd also like to pay my respects to elders past and present. Look, this afternoon, we're very privileged to have one of our board members, Nigel Phair, present a development opportunity for us on cybersecurity. As Drasko just alluded to earlier, look at this as it's a big topic that's impacting the world over, and in particular the humanitarian organisations which Nigel will touch on are and at times I suspect are particularly at risk. Nigel, I'll touch on your background at 21 years in the Australian Federal Police. You hold numerous directorships. You're a consultant in the area. You've published at least 3 books, maybe more by the time I've my research may have ended. But you are very much a leading expert in the area. I was reminded of that 2 weeks ago when reviewing the pitch for a software on fraud detection and payment protection, and I think you were quoted 3 times in the pitch with regard to the ever increasing threat in relation to cybercrime. So I'm very pleased to have you as a member of RedR's board in that respect, and to have you present to us today. I believe we settled on the title being the evolving cyber threat landscape, and in particular a focus on the humanitarian organisations in that regard. So without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Nigel.
Thanks, Will, and good afternoon, morning, evening, everyone, and thanks very much for your time. I didn't know, Will, that I've been used by vendors. Maybe I should get a cut of whatever their profits are.
Well, for a second, I thought I had to look for a conflict of interest, but it's all good.
And while I'm talking myself up, it's 5 books.
Wow.
That's all right. I'll get Helen to put that in your performance appraisal.
Noted.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to share my screen, which means I'm not going to see anyone's putting their hands up. So I'm happy for this to be as interactive as possible. So if people have got a question, a comment, or whatever, I am happy for them just to yell out and interrupt. So how's that sound, Will? Can you see I'm assuming it's working?
Working perfectly, Nigel.
All right. So I went for a more informal title. Will, I just went RedR and the Cybers.
That works for all of us.
Awesome. All right. So what I'm going to talk about this afternoon, and again, butt in if you've got questions, comments, concerns, whatever it might be. It's fine by me. I'm going to talk about the online environment, how we participate in it, what it means for a range of different verticals. One is, what does it mean for RedR? What does it mean for any organisation that are out there? And what does it mean for you personally? So when I think about cybersecurity, by the way, I dislike the word cyber. I like using the word information security. So I've been doing this for 22 years, and that's what it used to be called. And that's, to my mind, what it should be called is information security, because what we're trying to do from a corporate perspective is protect information assets. The most important thing that we do is collect an awful lot of data. We store an awful lot of data. We disseminate an awful lot of data. And along that way, it's open for a wide range of use, hopefully always legitimately. Unfortunately, sometimes evil actors for a range of issues get in the way. And of course, one of my favourite sayings is, when we look at all the data breaches that are out there, one of the best ways not to have a data breach is not to keep the data. So if we look at the life cycle of information that we, as I said, we collect, we store, we use, we disseminate, hopefully at the end of that, when it's no longer appropriate, we delete it. So that's the headline. And then the next headline I want you to think about is when we think about information is two things. It is where that information is stored, whether it's in the cloud, whether it's on a mainframe, whether it's in a device, a phone, a laptop, tablet, or whatever, and who our users are and how they get access to that information. Because I can provide you and this organization with the best cybersecurity tips going around. I can make this organization really, really secure. And you're probably thinking that's great. But along with that security also means you're probably not going to get much productivity done, because I'm going to make it really difficult. So when we think cybersecurity, we also want to think about usability. There's a magic triangle of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And too many people out there forget the availability. There is a reason that we are a digital first organization. Every organization is or should be digital first, because there's great productivity savings, there's great benefits for you as associate trainers, for those people on the call, for the staff that are on there, and my fellow board directors, etc. So we always want to think, how can we get the best out of technology? But how do we do that in a risk manner? And I'm going to be talking about risk in a couple of slides, because as we know, all roads lead to Rome, and in this case, Rome is risk. So let's kick it into gear. When I go back to the beginning of my, I'm going to keep using the word cybersecurity because I'm forced to. My cybersecurity career back in 2002, I was in the Australian Federal Police. And it was well before mobile smart devices. It was before social media. And people were just getting into what is technology? How can it be used? You know, you probably think back to the early 2000s, you went to work, you probably had a pretty clunky system. You had a screen that was probably deeper more than it was wider. And we were just getting into what is the internet? How are we going to use this great resource? And you know, I think Australians were pretty early adopters back then when I look at what was going on. Along with that early adoption of technology also came, unfortunately, an early adopter by the criminals. So when I talk about cybercrime, I put that into various buckets. I put it into nation states, and I won't call them out who they are because there's various ones. And they have various reasons why they want to attack us and other democracies. We have serious and organised crime. They're essentially in it for the money. We have low-level crime. People are just having a crack. They're just in it to have a crack. And then we also have insiders. And we never want to forget insider threats, because we all love our staff, but unfortunately, some of them do malicious things and some of them do silly things. And an example I will give you is we have a thing called the notifiable data breach scheme in Australia. It's been going for about 6 years, and the Australian Office of the Information Commissioner puts out twice yearly statistics. Two things have come out of those statistics every single time. One is the health sector is the #1 sector which is suffers from data breaches. And you might think to yourself, a good reason for that essentially is our health identifiers. You know, there is nothing more sensitive and more serious than losing health information. And the criminals know that, so they go for it. The other thing is, consistently about 1/3 of all data breaches are from insiders. Again, there's that combination of some are malicious and some are just silly. So we always got to be cognizant of that. But essentially, we love technology. And as I said in my opening remarks, we want to continue to love technology. We want to be looking at every opportunity that we can be digital first. We don't want to be so concerned, I believe, about sort of bad actors out there trying to do us harm that it stops us from enjoying technology, whether that's social media, whether that's other aspects of our life, our work life, our personal life. We want to always make sure that we're digital first. And we do get a lot of enjoyment out of it, but we'll go through some scenarios shortly where we don't necessarily get lots of value out of it. So it's great. It's really changed the way that we live. So what does that mean? as I said, it's all about risk. So I'll put this slide up here, depending on what you're reading this on. It's just an eyesight test, essentially, to see how quickly you can read, but I'll leave it up there. There's more and more reports coming out from, I'm going to call it the broader humanitarian sector, by various organisations, some consultants, some UN, some government, where they're really starting to look at what does it mean for humanitarian operations and what does it mean for the cyber environment. I probably could have put together a list and put it as an annex, but I didn't. But I just thought I'd grab these couple of paragraphs from what I've been reading. I think it's really, really interesting. I just want to pick some of these parts, some of these sentences apart, and what does it mean for us in the sector. So a couple of things, in no particular order. So firstly, the humanitarian sector is coming under cyber attack. We should not be naive to think that just because there's people out there doing good, there is not people out there trying to make bad from your activities. It is what it is, and we've got to be prepared for those attacks, and we've got to be able to be resilient. And that's a key word I also want to use, because you'll often hear people talk about protecting against a cyber attack. And I don't really like the word protection, because protection to me in the cyber environment is a point of time. RedR, for example, might do a range of things. We might get some penetration testing of a system. We might introduce some controls. We might do some range of other things to get protected. But the evolution of the threat environment is so vast, it is so quick that that happens pretty quickly. So where I want everyone to think is about being resilient to a cyber attack. So if something happens to you, whether it's personally on social media, whether it's a friend, a colleague, an organization you're working for, or indeed RedR, what we need to do is think to ourselves, what can we do to minimize a cyber incident, but what can we do to maximize our resilience if we pick up that something has happened? What are we essentially going to do? And we should exercise that exact thing. Exercise the fact that there's a data breach, exercise the fact that there's a malicious actor using social media purporting to be one of the staff or one of the trainers or one of the board directors or one of our stakeholder groups. There's lots of little scenarios that we can go through. So ransomware is the next thing. So ransomware has been and will continue to be the number one threat that we're going to face. The reason ransomware works so well is because people pay. And I've got about 50 soapboxes lined up here, and I'm glad that we're going to be talking for the next 3.5 hours on this, because I'll get through about 5 of them. And one of them is paying of ransomware. Now, sometimes you might think there's good reason for ransomware, and I should go back a step and actually explain what ransomware is for those that aren't aware. Ransomware can happen in many different ways, but essentially it's where cyber criminals generally get into a system, and they get into a system usually through a phishing attack. So a phishing attack, think, way back when, that dodgy email that came out now, which has become way more sophisticated, where they gain credential access to a system and they encrypt the system, and they follow that up with a demand saying, if you want to get back into your system, you better pay us some money. And by money, I mean crypto. And there's so much crypto out there. It can be any one of them. Often Monero, but can be any of them. That's one form of ransomware. The other form of ransomware, which sometimes happens at the same time, so we call it double ransomware, is where they encrypt the information, but they also steal the information and threaten to put it on the dark web. So if you think to some of the recent ones in Australia, the really big ones, Latitude Financial, Optus, Medibank Private, those forms of ransomware were all where they threatened to put the information. And we have so much of this that goes on. So you might think to yourself, the easiest way to stop this essentially is don't pay the ransom. Take away the criminal intent. So I sit firmly in that camp. However, I don't mind the odd little asterisk with the what about scenario. So if you're running a hospital and it's a neonatal hospital and it's particularly vulnerable, and the bad actors, the criminals, do a ransomware and say, we're going to take this hospital offline unless you pay. In some circumstances, I'll be prepared to have that discussion. But from an Australian perspective, well over 50%, the stats tell us well over 50% of organisations are paying ransom. So what happens when you pay the ransom? Well, cyber criminals can be amazingly rational creatures when they want to be. Amazingly rational. So sometimes if you pay the ransom, they will give you the decryption keys back and you can decrypt the volume, the hard drive that you've been encrypted, and you'll get your information back. Sometimes they'll give you part of the decryption keys back and you'll get a little bit of your information back. Sometimes you'll pay and they won't give you anything back because they think to themselves, this is great. We've got someone that's a payer. Let's see if we can get some more pay out of them. So they say, look, we're not going to give it to you. We want some more Bitcoin or some more whatever cryptocurrency. You know, here's a surprise. Criminals don't always hold their word. Who would have thought? Anyway, so ransomware keeps on keeping on. The vector is phishing. Phishing just happens in so many different ways. And I mean, a scenario might be for the people on this call, you are on your way to a conference. It could be a donor conference. It could be any type of humanitarian related conference. The conference organisers put on their website that you're coming to be the keynote speaker or part of a panel or whatever it might be. And then the cyber criminals look at all this. They look you up on LinkedIn. They look you up on all the other socials, and they'll contact you and they'll say, and they'll pretend to be maybe another conference organiser and say, we see you speaking at this one. We'd love you to speak at our event. And you go, oh, this is awesome. I like this conference speaking gig. And they will send you a form to fill out, you know, which is nothing unusual. It'll have your details. You know, they want to organise your flights and your accommodation. So you put all this in there. So you download this form onto your system, not knowing there's malicious software in the back end of this form, because cyber criminals just don't occasionally perhaps get access to a network. They have to do something. There has to be a downloading of some malware. So they need you to do something. And that doing something might be what looks like a pretty casual form that you fill out because you're going to go and speak at this conference, for example. Once they do that, essentially they get access to the network. Now, the average time that a cyber criminal is in a network before they do anything is around 250 days. That's a long time. It's the best part of a year. And what they'll do is they'll move laterally within a network and they'll look for the crown jewels. And the crown jewels might be all sorts of information. It might be pay information. It might be bills. It might be anything. And so when the time comes and they've got what they want, they've exfiltrated the data, they've moved around, they've deleted stuff, they've done whatever, and they'll crypt it and they'll follow that up with the ransomware. So that's a pretty simple scenario, which happens so regularly, it's just amazing. So the next part, where I like these couple of paragraphs, is the next part is critical infrastructure. A global phenomenon is what we call critical infrastructure protection. So when we think cybersecurity, we should also think an all hazards approach. We shouldn't just think about the digital. We should think about what we call operational technologies. We should think about all risk to what we are doing, because technology is so interrelated to everything we do. We need to be cognizant of everything around us that is probably what we call IP enabled on the internet, all sorts of things that we do. It's not just our smart device, it's our transport, it's everywhere we operate and everywhere we do. So governments globally, including Australia, are putting a lot more resources into critical infrastructure protection. In fact, Australia has around 11 what we call key pieces of critical infrastructure. And as humanitarians, the work that you do would fall into one or many of those. It includes education, includes cloud storage, includes the built environment, it includes oil, gas, water, it includes health, it includes higher education, it includes pretty much everything that you do. So there is a lot of work being done, but we've got to be cognizant of our role that we play within critical infrastructure and what we can do to ensure the resilience against a cyber attack. And lastly, as I've mentioned in my little introduction, it's all about, also got to include, I should say, your personal well-being, what you post on social media, how you have your settings on the social media accounts that you use. So I'm not going to tell you what your settings should be. I have my own beliefs on that. And if you choose to have different beliefs, that is completely fine with me. What I would really like for you to do after this is go into each of your social media accounts and review those settings and make sure they're at a level that you are comfortable with. Periodically, the social media companies will change those settings on you because they would like them to be more open than not. They want you eyeballed on their platform as much as possible because it's ad supported. So the more that you can put in there, the more that you put about yourself, the more that you geolocate what you do, the more photos you upload, the more posts that you make, the more comments, etc., etc. That all goes into the magic word called the algorithm, and they will serve you with certain information based on that. And for the conspiracy theorists out there that wonder if Facebook is listening to you, I'm convinced they are. There's been too many times I've been talking about things and I've looked up Facebook and there's been ads on that. So there's my little bit for the afternoon. So there is risk. We are front and center of it. In fact, everyone in society is front and center of it, and we need to be really aware about that. So what does it all mean? What does it mean when we talk about cyber risk? So we need to recognize in our day-to-day activities, as I said, whether it's organizational or whether it's personal, we need to recognize the cyber risks that go with our adoption of technology. And I keep wanting to stress, I don't want you to think that we should minimize our use of technology. I'm a very pro technologist. There's lots of good that we can get. There's lots of productivity that we can get out of that. So, but we need to acknowledge that what we do in our day-to-day comes with risk. We need to simplify those risks. We need to really basically sit down and go, you know, what am I about to do? What is the risk in that? You know, and think about it from as simple terms as possible. It's very easy to overcomplicate cybersecurity. In fact, many consultants have made a career out of overcomplicating cybersecurity. So when you go to do something, I want you to think in the most possible, simplified way possible. If I make this social media post, how could it impact on me and others online? You know, we all want to be good digital citizens, and we don't want anyone to be distressed by any posts that we make. We don't want to cause harm, etc., etc. And we don't want other people to do that. So we need to be cognizant of our friends and families around that. If we're going to adopt a new piece of software that we've seen online, if we're going to get into AI, and one of the things Helen and I have been talking about, when Will also about, is creating some sort of guidance on the use of AI and doing it safely, securely, and with governance attached to it. So what does it mean to adopt technology? What if we use one of the AI vendors out there, where is that information being held? For example, who else has access to it? How much are we creating a good user experience? I want you to also think about a control framework. And that's a bit of a technical term. But when we look at standards, and I'm going to be talking about standards in the next slide. When we think about standards and risk, we talk about the control. So risk, the basics of risk is basically we look at what the risk is, and if we don't accept the risk, it means we need to control that risk. We might need to put something in. So if we've got our device, a control might be making sure we enact multi-factor authentication in our banking app. In fact, any app that comes. It might be from a network perspective, making sure there's firewalls that are in place, that there's antivirus protection. It might mean also if we're introducing new software and we're collecting data, some people don't need to have access to that. That's part of the organization. So we do privileged access management and we restrict the ability to people to see some things. So if that happens to you and you think, why am I not getting access? There could be a good reason for that. There might be a reason that you should get access to it and you can have that conversation with the right people. But there's lots of things that we can put together into a control framework that will minimize risk. We're never going to completely get rid of risk. As I said in the opening, I can create the best cybersecurity program for RedR and it will drive the organization to a standstill. We don't want that. There's a happy medium somewhere in the middle where we're resilient to cyber attack and we bring in controls on a needs basis. And of course, cost also comes into a control framework. There's lots of software the organization can buy. There's lots of hardware the organization can buy that will do it. But, you know, we're a cash constrained organization. We're not one of the big four banks. And we've got to make decisions that are based on cost. That's just the reality. Decisions are based on risk. Decisions are also based on cost. And the organization, in fact, any organization needs to spend an amount of money. And essentially, when you look at cyber risk, you are spending an amount of money and doing a range of different program activities to stop something that may or may not happen. And your program might be great, but it still might not stop it. In fact, any consultant that tells you that their program of risk mitigation will stop something from happening, because it may and it may not. So, you know, we need to keep it simple. We need to introduce controls on a cost basis, on a risk basis, and on a needs basis. And again, that's the same with what you do personally. You know, antivirus for your phone, your laptop, your tablet is pretty cheap. A couple of $100 will get you 5 devices. It's the best couple of $100 you can probably ever spend. Similar, as I mentioned, with multi-factor authentication. All the key banking apps have it. All your key Microsoft et al., Google all have authenticator apps. Now, importantly, we also need ownership. We can't just say this is someone else's problem. And the reason, if I put the RedR hat on, the reason we have a risk and audit committee is that we talk about, amongst many other things, we definitely talk about an all hazards approach to the organisation. But we have ownership within that, and it's the senior management that when we talk about what the risks are the organisation faces, what we're going to do about it, and who's going to own it. Because we need someone to own it, because if sometimes people might think everyone should own it, and when everyone owns it, I'm a full belief that no one actually owns it. So super important that there is an owner for each of these programs and that they introduce the control framework. We measure the certain controls, we work out what's working, what's not, and we change those controls over time as we change our use of technology and the business of the organisation changes. And of course, it needs to be measured and reported. The best, if we're going to be spending money, we need to get the best bang for our buck. And we need to be able to measure these controls. We need to be able to have a dashboard that talks about the sorts of things that we're doing, so that risk and audit committees, the board, senior management can have an idea of their scarce resources, what it means, and whether they're appropriately adjusted for a certain amount of time. But most importantly, there is no technical silver bullet. You may read the brochures, you may hear the conference presentations, you may read the books, you might do all sorts of things. Anyone that says, I'm going to fix your problems is probably very misguided. As I mentioned, this is a journey that we're on. This is a journey that will never end. As we keep adopting technology, as we keep changing our use of technology, the risks are going to morph in and out. We're always going to have ransomware and we're always going to have phishing. They've been around, let's call it, for a couple of decades. How they get used will be amazing. I mentioned AI. When you start to see the use of AI in cyber attacks. It is the volume, because that's what our AI allows you. The volume is astounding. Everything from, remember we used to get those emails that had poor English. Now AI changes that. There is always really good English. Things are crafted really well. The volume of cyber attacks that is now occurring, courtesy of AI, is astounding. I talked before about crypto. There is so many different crypto coins, stable coins, etc. out there that they are just ripe. You know, there's so many stories out there about people with crypto wallets that have been compromised. The use of crypto as a way to launder money as the proceeds of crime is similarly astounding. So when you put that hand in hand with what AI can do, this is going to keep on keeping on, which is great if you're someone like me and pulls a dollar out of this. Lots of things to talk about, lots of things to think about. So the cyber risk will keep on keeping on. How it evolves going forward with, as I said, with AI, the use of crypto, particularly the mainstream use of crypto. Like, everyone thinks that crypto just automatically equals money laundering, and to an extent it does, but it also enables people. If you look at guest workers, if you look at the Pacific Islanders, for example, that come to Australia and work picking fruit, doing other tasks, they send a lot of that money back home. Happens all through Southeast Asia, obviously, as well. But the banks and some of the other institutions charge heavy fees for remitting money. So why not use a form of crypto? Makes perfect sense to me. But, you know, the criminals are onto that, and they make dodgy wallets and they make dodgy crypto schemes, and they suck people in through phishing to remit their money, and they don't remit the money. So there's lots of tiny little case studies where we think, you know, oh, we should just ban crypto, when actually we shouldn't, because it's enabling a lot of people, and should enable a lot of people, to remit money with much lower fees. The lower the fees, the more money they can remit back home, the better the prosperity for the people receiving the money. So we should be, again, I keep harping on that. We need to encourage the use of technology, because there's a lot of good out there, lots of little use cases out there. So, and the other one is quantum. Some of you might have heard of quantum. I won't go into the ins and outs of quantum computing, but essentially, at a very high level, your typical computer operates on ones and zeros, and think of it as a light switch. A one might be the light switch is on, and off, and a zero, the light switch is off. But with with quantum, that light switch is either always on or always off. That one and that zero is a constant, and that's where you get the speed and the velocity of the compute power. And you think that is awesome, because, you know, that is what gives us our multi-factor authentication. That's what gives us so many types of things quantum. But I can tell you now, the criminals are trialing quantum to defeat a lot of those things. You know, you might have heard of the company RSA, and they'll tell you that their algorithms take years to break with traditional computing. Quantum will take that down to minutes. So we've got a lot in front of us, a lot of things that need to be considered in the online environment with compute power. The good news is there's lots of people trying to solve these problems, but while they solve them, the criminals are using exactly the same concepts to defeat it. So interesting times ahead. So where are we at? How are we gonna, what are we gonna do? So there's a number of ways to look at our cyber journey. And as I've mentioned before, it's not so much that we've achieved a cyber. We need to be resilient, and we need to think about cyber as not that we've got it or we haven't got it, but rather as a maturity. And for any organisation that you're involved in, and again, for your own personal online standards, is think to yourself, what is my cyber maturity? You know, have I adjusted, or have I looked at and maybe adjusted my controls on my social media? Have I made sure there's multi-factor authentication enabled for all my accounts possible? Because we give people advice, and sometimes we give people, I believe, and I speak from someone in the industry, we give people poor advice. We say things like, don't click on links. I'm sure you've all heard it. Well, I can tell you now, I click on links all day because you have to. I get sent things that are linked all the time, and it's mostly legitimate. So we give people, I believe, unrealistic expectations. We say to people, don't use the same password across multiple logins. I can tell you now, I use the same password across multiple logins. I don't want people feeling bad they do that because you've probably got about 30 logins, and I don't expect you to have 30 different passwords. What I do expect you to have is a really good passphrase. So we're going to get away from passwords. How many times do you see when you log in somewhere? And I'm going to think of Robert Kerr here because he and I are both have some affiliation with UNSW. Their latest password manager expects you to have, I think it's 14 characters with a number of letters, numbers, characters. You've got to have you can't repeat the same thing. You've got to have a capital. It's unwieldy. So people end up, what people think when they're doing this with all the best intention, is people actually end up with very poor passwords. Because I can tell you now, anytime that password manager tells you you have to have a capital, I can guarantee you'll do that capital at the very first letter, because that's how we type. That's what we're pre-programmed to do. So that's defeated straight away. The criminals know that you're going to start off with a capital. There's lots of password cracking software out there. So if you want to go long, because long is strong, a phrase is the best thing to do. The longer that phrase, the better it is. And you can put a string of words together that are meaningful to you. And with where the opportunities where you're forced to put in characters, you can put in underscores between those words. But basically think long is strong. You can also use a password manager. A lot of people like them. A lot of people don't like them. A lot of people are concerned that if you lose the access to your password manager, you have lost the access to your passwords, which is true. I keep talking about multi-factor authentication. Nothing is better than that, because if you get your passwords compromised, and passwords get compromised all the time, the latest example was the superannuation accounts, where people used legitimate login credentials to get access and steal people's superannuation accounts. That is defeated through multi-factor authentication. Now, the next issue with multi-factor authentication is there's good and there's not so good. So anything where it's an SMS verification falls in the not so good. So we say to organisations, bring in multi-factor authentication, so they do, but if they bring in an SMS one, it can be defeated really, really simple. You just take over someone's device, which is pretty simple to do. Best multi-factor is the app where you hold up to your face and has facial recognition. That's the gold standard. So that's some maturity things for you to think about for your own individual use in the online environment. From an organisational perspective, what's some things to think about? So a compliance way is not a bad way to commence cyber maturity. So when I talk about compliance, I talk about things like the Australian government's Essential 8, the US government's NIST cybersecurity framework, and also the ISO 27001. They're probably the three main ones. There's probably about 30 or 40 compliance frameworks that are out there. The reason I like compliance frameworks is by default they all have a control framework, firstly, and by default they increase your cyber capability. So they look at it and they go, right, by you enacting things, by you thinking about cybersecurity and frameworks and controls afterwards, you are increasing your cyber maturity. In fact, the Australian government's Essential 8, and hence 8, there's 8 key factors to it, has 3 levels of maturity. So you can, as an organisation, think to yourself, really only works for Microsoft organisations. You can think to yourself, I'm going to go through level 1, then we'll go through level 2, level 3, because as I keep saying, this is a journey. We're not at an end state. So that's a good way of commencing cyber maturity. As we go through being compliance focused, we get into what we call being a risk focused, and that's detailing and doing an analysis of what are the risks that are facing me with the implementation of technology, the collection of data and its use. And some of that might happen in a compliance phase, but this is where we're increasing our maturity and we're starting to think, you know, what is the risk? What is the risk to my organisation of doing these things? Am I prepared to accept this risk? And if it goes back to what I said before, then we need to document it, we need to measure it, we need an owner. And then we go to our next levels of maturity when we really start looking at threat intelligence. And if you're part of an organisation that is taking a threat intelligence-led approach to cyber security, that's when you're starting to get to the top of the game. This is when we're talking about, this is when banking and finance, this is high-end critical infrastructure protection. This is when you look at the threats, you look at the intelligence, you look at what's happening within your sector, you're sharing information, and you're looking at high-end cyber criminals. As I said, this is when we're talking about this, the state-sponsored attacks. This is very sophisticated, serious and organised crime. And it's a very big resource to be threat intelligence led. You need a lot of people, you need a lot of kit, a lot of software, a lot of thinking. But this is when you're at the top of the game and your maturity is at its highest. So what are we going to do about it? Well, there's lots we're going to do about it. I've just given some examples of things that we're going to do: multi-factor authentication, passphrases. We're going to look at our social media settings. In an organisation, we're going to be alert to the sorts of emails, the sorts of opportunities that come along, the sorts of people that might reach out to us, whether it makes sense. We're going to be cognizant of any data that we collect. Why are we collecting it? And when you come down to the why are we collecting it, it comes down to that, what is the purpose that we're going to use or reuse this data? If we're just collecting it to store it, that's great. If there's people doing a course, what's the actual data that we need to know about that? You know, some of it might make complete sense. Some of it might be health related, and we've got to be cognizant of the people on the course. But some of it might not be. So we've got to be wary of the data. And as I said at the outset, the best way not to have a data breach is not to have the data. So we need to think about things like encrypting the data that we keep. We need to be thinking about who has access and why to certain amounts of data or to certain parts of the network. If we are storing data, we need to think about, does it get stored on the network as a warm backup? Does it get, or a hot backup? Does it get stored offline? And people often ask me, you know, how much should you back up data and how often? The simple answer to that is, how much can you go without that data? So if you're part of an organisation and you back up data every Friday afternoon and you unplug it from the system, because I can tell you now, cyber criminals, when they get access, backups, they'll encrypt the backups as well, because people will often say, well, I can't believe I had a ransomware attack, I had backups. And well, it's like, that's unfortunate, because they get encrypted as well. So if you're part of an organisation and you're backing up data every Friday, that means your risk thinking is you can go a week, because that's how long it is without that information. If you think, well, we're critical, we can only go a day, then that means you need to back up data every day. If you think we're really critical, we can't even go a day, then you need to be backing up every hour. These are all risk decisions. So on that, that's the end of the show. But no questions. I've done a lot of talking. No one gets to go home or log off until I ask a question.
Nigel, I'll start. I guess I almost got two really. I mean, holistically, are you concerned that that the threat is outpacing the protection?
100%.
Yeah, I guess it almost leads, I guess, the threat before
Yep.
protection, but the gap's got much larger.
Yep.
Um,
And with that, we've got to make sure we don't get complacent that it won't. I don't want to, again, I don't want to overcook it, but we don't want to be complacent that we're not a bank, it won't happen to us. Because I could spend hours talking and giving you scenarios of, non-banks that have been hit with ransomware.
well, I guess then I'll bring it back to us selfishly, but humanitarian sector in particular, the smaller actors, I guess back to your, the issues there of, cost. Are you finding that, humanitarian not-for-profits, charities considered softer targets because they might have cost implications and not have the same level of security? Is there anything in that regard?
I don't know is the answer, and the sort of the stats that we have don't call out sectors, for example.
Right.
So, but there's lots of, if you look at Australia, 97+% of small businesses, less than 19 staff, and they get smashed day in and day out. And it's hard for tiny organisations. For a lot of them, they're trying to keep alive, keep the lights on, keep doing whatever they do. And then to say to them, oh, and by the way, you've got to make this consideration and this investment. And so, for any humanitarian organisation, the first question that I would ask if they start thinking that we're not a bank and it won't happen to us goes back to that. If your staff come in tomorrow morning and can't log onto the network, what are you going to do? And that goes back to the all hazards approach, Will, that the reason they might not work is that, the network might not work because there was a bobcat out the front that dug through the fibre optic cable as part of roadworks. That can be just as debilitating as, a cyber criminal. So we need to practice all this sort of stuff.
Thanks, Nigel. I think Drasko's put his hand up.
Yep. We got Drasko, you got a question?
Yeah, look, I'm really pleased that you actually raised the issue of AI. But can I also ask you, from your experience, look, you fight the crime with a similar sort of weapons, you don't fight the crime with the words. But so on that topic, I guess, one of the solutions definitely will be more and more we go into the future, which is whatever, next 6 months or next 3 years, is to use the AI basically to do the same thing in terms of protection. Because it also does save money, and specifically for the smaller agencies or businesses, and you can implement it. Now, I'm not saying that anybody can do that, everybody should be doing that, but it was more kind of try to understand from your understanding as well and experience in the industry, where we are with that now. Do any agencies in the sector, for example, are using that? Is it successful? Is it prohibitively expensive? Is it technologically sort of expensive because you have to also have a specific staff? So just a couple of pointers, just to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Yeah, no, for sure, Drasko. Great question. So yeah, I only talked about criminals using AI. Yes, there are lots of software vendors and startups looking at how they can use AI to find the threats that are out there and on the network and in the wild. So lots of research being done. I don't think we're there yet. We're going to get to the stage of brochures, just like lots of brochures say they have military grade security. We're going to have lots of brochures going, we're AI driven, and it's going to be, unfortunately, a buzzword just for a lot of them, because to some extent, AI can be whatever you want it to be. But there's lots of cool stuff that is out there. And getting off the subject a bit, I'm hoping everyone in this call is using your co-pilots and chat GPTs, if anything, just to play to understand how this stuff is working. While you're doing that, you are training the model. Just be conscious of that. Be conscious of the things you put into those engines. So, I know people that sit on boards, they get the board pack and they copy and paste it and put it straight into chat GPT and say, give me the key things I need to know about this. And people might go, that's awesome. But you've also just given up what is potentially very, very sensitive information to what is a publicly available, trained repository of data that is kept probably in the US. So be alert to that sort of stuff too. There's and that's when we start then having to talk about having private chat GPT and LLMs and those sorts of things. But there's lots of cool stuff you can do with it. Joe.
Thanks, Nigel. Super interesting. Glad you raised the chat GPT thing, because I know that's a really big thing that's coming up, and people are telling me about all the things that they're sharing to ask it to summarize, and I'm like, you do realize that most of that's not going to be safe. But anyway, two quick things. One is I don't know whether there's any geographic regional variation in the patterns and trends you're seeing, or we're so globalized now, it's all just universal, all regions experiencing the same things. And I don't know whether that matters much for us in terms of operations teams support in other parts of the world, but just interested if there's any interesting patterns that are different. The second one is, and probably because I have a particular interest in this, I was reading something about sort of the techniques being used in relation to crypto, and it was how some of the chat tools like Discord and other chat tools that people use for other purposes are also now being sucked more into this. So not that people are necessarily being tricked into be my friend and blah blah blah, but more if they make in-app purchases or share information in apps, then it's tracked and people are being brought in more through that. And I think that's newer, but this is not my expertise, so I'd love to hear more if you're hearing more about that. And I'm thinking about that particularly as a parent, but I'm working with young people, but also for us in terms of how we chat more informally with each other through Teams or other mechanisms, and start sharing nuggets, and whether those nuggets can be then sucked up into. Anyway, so those are my two questions: regional variations and other methods for through chat sharing communications, whether that's a pattern.
Great questions. For the first one, yeah, it's an interesting one. Australia were second. If I go back to fishing, Australia was second globally. First globally was South America, and then came us, well before North America and well before Europe, when it came to fishing attacks, which in its early days were quite rudimentary. A lot of people used to go, the wires. I don't think anyone has an answer. So regionally, we get attacked these days just like anyone gets attacked. But we're a rich jurisdiction and we pay ransomware, as I mentioned, and why not go where the money is? So, we're equal, if not more, susceptible to that. To answer your second one, it's a super interesting one. So, it goes without saying there's predators on all social media, and not just the kid stuff. Lots on the kid stuff, lots on the adult stuff. There's all you got to do is look at the all the stuff that goes on. There's plenty written about how people prey on people of all ages, of all demographics, of all religions, of all socioeconomic backgrounds, of all everything. There's no just one hard rule around that. So it's unfortunately just as it is. You talked about some of those platforms. If you look at Roblox, for example, Roblox dollars is a great way for criminals to launder money. So there's lots of methods how predators get access to that, particularly the young people. They'll purport to be a young person. They'll get in on a game. They'll do all sorts of things. It's horrible. It's not the word for it, but there's and trying to teach kids how to be safe and secure online, how to teach them that when they're not sure of something, to have a conversation with a parent or a guardian or someone they trust, is a more difficult thing than you can possibly imagine. It's easy to create brochures and say things. Getting it into action is another thing. And I don't think anyone's got a hard and fast way of what works and what doesn't. It's just constantly giving them options to, I'm having a bad experience. Just like young people need to be able to reduce their screen time just for their own just normal sanity, even if they're not having a bad experience. You know, being constantly online, I don't think is a good thing for any of us at any age. Admire.
Thanks.
Thanks, Nigel. Very insightful. I had a question about, let's say when we travel to different countries and or checkpoints, or when government officials in some countries ask us to put aside a mobile phone or a laptop, or when they do their own thing, that we lose our device from our site. And do they plan something like Pegasus, or is it something where is a way to check if our phones have been compromised in any way, because they usually run in the background?
Great question.
Thanks.
The answer is possible, probable, yes, who knows. Every time you lose sight of your device is a concern. And they might not be planning it with spyware, or they might be. They also might just be sucking the contents from it. You know, that happens at legitimate borders. It happens when you fly in, it can happen when you fly into Australia. And I know from when I was in the police, they are very good at sleight of hand, the customs official, when there's a person of interest, when they get the device and they turn around and give it to someone, and they can suck the contents out of your device in minutes. You know, luckily in places like Australia, it's done under legitimate legislation and for legitimate belief, not just suspicion of criminal activity. But where a lot of you travel to, those governments don't have those sorts of things. And the software to suck out the contents of your phone is freely available and is legal. So I think it's a double whammy thing. Is one, they might be planning software, as you mentioned, Pegasus, and you definitely won't know. And they could also be taking out your contacts, your social media, any documents, etc., etc. I don't have an answer to what to do about it, because you're more well skilled in this than I am. You know, probably in some instances you won't proceed unless, you know, you give up access or something. You know, you can carry a burner phone. Sometimes that's practical, often it's not. Same with laptops. You can, you know, encrypt certain amounts of data on external devices. That's probably maybe the best thing. But then, you know, a lot of laptops these days, and definitely if you operate off a tablet, if you have an external thumb drive, you can't use it. You can potentially use a cloud environment with it, which is encrypted and also has multi-factor authentication and a strong passphrase to access certain amounts of data. That's probably the best thing.
Thanks.
Hi, Nigel. This is Louise Atkins. Thank you so much for your time today. It's been really interesting. And one point that stood out to me, this is not really a question, it's more of just something that I think we can think about a little bit more at RedR, is around just how much information we're collecting and storing. You know, that's an area that we can definitely review. It's tricky because there's our operational information. There's also information that donors may request, and we may not always get a heads up for information that they need. So we may over collect. So I think it's a really important piece that we'll need to reflect on internally. So yeah, thanks for sharing. Yeah,
no, and none of this is easy. There's no particular simple way of addressing this. It's horses for courses, because yeah, we've got to be pragmatic at the end of the day.
Yeah.
But thanks, Sally.
Hi. It's really interesting. There's a lot of things to think about, but I wanted to ask, what is your advice if someone that we support is impacted by ransomware or something to that? What advice should we hold and deliver to them to support them?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, I talked about critical infrastructure protection being a number one topic. A number two topic is what we call third parties. And we have lots of third parties that we deal with. We have lots of third parties we have to deal with, and we're third parties to other organisations. So if a lot of this, I'm going to get around to answering your question in a long-winded way. Sometimes when you look at data breaches, for example, there'll be an organisation will suffer from a ransomware attack and they'll be fingered on, not on that organisation, but on another one. So RedR might use a third party and they might have poor cybersecurity controls. They have the data breach and it ends up being information that we've collected. And this is just a fact of doing business, third parties. You can't, imagine what it's like for the supermarket chains and those sorts of ones where they have tens of thousands of them. So, but it'll be in the media, RedR data lost. And the media will knock on the door and ring Helen and Will and say, and Robert and say, what's happening? What are you doing? And you have no idea. And it's a tough one to answer. So I think to answer your question is practicing that scenario. So if that happens, if it's an organisation we're dealing with suffers a ransomware attack, and whether we give them advice, whether we want to ask them whether any of our RedR data was caught up in it, for example, that is probably a piece of policy that we need to internally come up with, because I don't have a specific answer to give you. But it's a great question.
That touches on the second thought I had, was, do we need to review our policy on this? But that's something that we can take forward and work on. Thank you.
That's right. Nick, I think you're up next. G'day, Nick. Good to see you.
Hi, Nigel. How's it going? Thanks very much for the presentation. Really useful. Apologies if you covered this. I had a very brief call in the middle of that. But when you were talking about passwords, what's your take on password managers, the kind of built-in ones in Chrome and other browsers, or the one that comes on your phone on iOS? What's your kind of take on them? Good or inherently bad, or somewhere in the middle?
I think somewhere in the middle, and I think it might be Jill's question, because she's put a ton of good stuff in the chat, which is awesome. I haven't had a proper read of it. I think actually, like password managers, I more favour than not. I did make a mention that if you lose access to your master passphrase, then you're in strife. But I'm an Apple fanboy, and I'll often use the inbuilt, when it says suggesting a password, I'll often use that. Sometimes it gets tricky across devices, particularly if you're not across Mac devices. It won't acknowledge them, and so you're back to square one. But once you get into Macs, it's the equivalent of crack cocaine. You're on the drug and you're not coming off it.
Very good. Thanks. Interesting analogy. Thanks, Nigel. Useful. Cheers.
Thank you very much for that, Nigel.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Nigel. That was so interesting. One password, kind of following on from Nick's comment. Like I've used one password. I looked into it, before I went onto it. I find it really good, but I guess I wonder, what are the risks? But also for RedR, do you think we should use an organizational password manager? I know other organizations do that. What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, well, possibly, and it comes back to the risk. What is the risk that we're trying to? Goes back to what I was saying before with cost. So that organizational wide password managers aren't obscenely expensive, but there is a cost. So as an organisation, we probably need to have that discussion based on what is the risk that we're trying to address, and have we seen a compromise of passwords. So when I was talking before about the maturity cycle and got into threat intelligence, when you get into the threat intelligence realm, you start buying in services that search the dark web for compromised passwords within the RedR domain. Where, so for example, someone's used in a RedR employee has used a same password that's been compromised in one of those many data breaches, and it's out there and it's live. So we should have that conversation, but it comes with talking about risk, and it comes with talking about cost.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
Maybe,
have I been pawned? That website?
Have I been pwned?
Phones, yeah. So
That's right,
check
yep.
that for our
Yep.
like email addresses that we use routinely.
Yep.
And yeah, that's a good idea.
Yep.
Okay, cool.
So,
Thank you.
So whilst I was talking before about, you know, I think it's impractical not to share passwords to an extent. I think for those on the call that have got RedR access, you should have your own corporate RedR passphrase that is only used in RedR and not elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you.
Brasco, you already had one question, but because I'm feeling charitable, you can have a second.
Hey, Nigel, thanks for that. Yeah, I'm coming to my favorite topic, which is actually the governance, of course, and how the board and the senior executive is taking the risk approach, and is that really being covered, and also how transparent you are. So just asking, because I'm not pretending that I know ins and outs of RedR or what you currently have. I would assume you have a cyber risk somewhere within your risk management, whatever it is, a matrix. But question to you is also, because I know not only in the past, but only now, we also put a lot of that stuff specifically related to counterterrorism, and and fraud and, laundering money. Is it something that is actually separately, or would it be advisable to have a separate policy on that, which is outside of that particular one, also from the perspective of legal responsibility and fiduciary responsibility of the board members? Because it's hard to argue in front of the court and something happens. That's one, just to understand, if RedR is working on that, of which I think, this type of training information sessions are a great example of doing and minimizing the risk. And the second one is, never forget about that, just in this one. Thank you.
Awesome. To answer that question, I'm going to take it on notice, because that's a board-wide and with management discussion that probably should be led by Robert as the chair. So you raise a very valuable point. And when we look at cyber crimes, we talk about some crimes are technology specific and some are just enabled by technology. And so money laundering is enabled by technology. Counterterrorism can, for example, be enabled by, not in all cases, but enabled by technology. I'm not going to comment whether we should or shouldn't have a policy and those sorts of things, but we will take it on as notice and we will discuss it appropriately. But a good thing to raise. So thank you.
Nigel, unless there's any more questions, of which there was quite a lot, you can sometimes judge the success of a presentation based on that. So it was really good engagement. I think it's probably a testament to how seriously everyone's taking the threat and how prevalent it's become at the moment. So thank you so much. As I said, and everyone was aware, we recorded this session, so we actually want to use it for anyone who's missed it, but also we think we might use it as a bit of an onboarding for people that come on board. We might even work with you to to sort of probably more formalize it as we go forward and we look at those things together. But thank you again, Nigel. As I said, it was been very interesting to see you being quoted 2 weeks ago with software designed to prevent just this. It's been a pleasure, and I'll also put it out there if there are any other further questions from anyone here that they could send them through to me, and I could forward them on to you, Nigel, get back to them.
Yep, awesome. Yep, no, thanks, Will. Thanks, everyone, for turning up. It's much appreciated. I enjoy doing this stuff, so have a great time online.